Hey, I'm Manuel Quinones. I'm the new editor of E&E Daily. So we've had a little bit of a change in the leadership of the publication, but we're still expecting to provide the coverage folks who pay attention to E&E News have grown accustomed to. We definitely want to be more consistent, make sure that our legislative coverage, our political coverage doesn't have, I guess, holes in it, that we keep providing what people expect on a constant basis, and people can come to trust us even more than many folks already do to get their energy and environment news with a political and Capitol Hill focus. And kind of previewing what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks and months on Capitol Hill this fall, we've assembled a team of some of our best folks who report for Greenwire and E&E Daily, starting with Geof Koss, who focuses a lot on energy policy on Capitol Hill and other issues. Arianna Skibell, who's been covering regulations and has recently moved to focus more on climate, and she's been doing great. And George Cahlink, who really keeps an eye on the global Capitol Hill developments, energy policy, and beyond. So I guess starting overall, let's start broad. What are we expecting that's going to happen this fall? It's going to be a crazy fall. We're kind of nervous for it already. George, what are you expecting?
Well, I think the headline for this fall is going to be fiscal fights. Government funding runs out at the end of September, so Congress is going to need to figure out a way to deal with that. There's also a debt ceiling that the federal government's going to run into at the end of September that they're going to have to deal with. And on top of that, over the past few weeks, obviously, Texas has been slammed by Hurricane Harvey, and Congress is going to need to deal with that. So there's got to be a lot of fiscal issues colliding over the next 4 weeks, and that's really going to dominate the floors in both the House and the Senate as they figure out what money they can provide. Can they reach deals? Do they need to pass stopgap spending bills? And there's various points along the way with all these bills that members in either chamber can raise objections that can slow things down. Mm-hmm. And if things really go off the rails, as we've seen in the past, could even lead to a government shutdown, or in a worst case scenario, even an unprecedented default on the federal debt. So lots going on, a lot of fiscal stuff.
Now, we know the president had earlier threatened to potentially shut down the government if he didn't get money for his border wall. There's been other acrimony going on regarding the negotiations, but the hurricane and following tropical storm, as bad as it was, it seems to be greasing the skids a little bit.
Yeah, ironically, the hurricane for the legislative process could help move it along. There's bipartisan support for providing some aid for Hurricane Harvey victims. What we're hearing is maybe $5 to $6 billion in initial funding, but funding could get a lot broader. But what people are looking at now doing is seeing what they can attach to that aid package. Can you get all the spending bills for fiscal 18 on there? Can you get a 3-month CR to give you more time to negotiate? Can you get a debt ceiling on there? So yeah, Harvey could be sort of the vernacular in Capitol Hill is the legislative vehicle that would carry a lot of these other things over the finish line and get them signed into law. Yet to be seen, but yeah, that will be a key thing to watch over the coming weeks.
Cool. And before we move to kind of a focus on energy policy, you mentioned the 3-month CR. It seems increasingly likely that they're not going to get the full appropriations done.
Right. There's no signs that they're going to get the full appropriations done. There's 12 annual appropriations bills. None are signed into law. Mm-hmm. The federal government starts its new fiscal year October 1st. It's almost certain they're going to have some sort of short-term spending measure, again in Capitol Hill vernacular, a CR, continuing resolution. And the betting now is, as has been in the past, that will run about 3 months until the end of the year to give Congress the fall and early winter to negotiate a final package and perhaps do something before they leave for the holidays and come back for the second session.
Well, the Senate hasn't even marked up a single bill yet, have they?
Yeah, the Senate has not marked up many bills. They've moved a few, but not many. And we have a couple big ones coming up this week in the Senate. We have Labor HHS, which is the biggest domestic spending bill. And we also have the State Foreign Ops bill, which I'm sure Arianna will be paying attention to some of the international climate spending that's in that bill that's been particularly controversial with conservatives. So we are seeing some movement in the Senate, but certainly they're nowhere near as long as the House. So I think we're starting to see a CR, probably 3 months, take us till the end of the year, and then we'll see where they are. It's not unprecedented that Congress can come back in September or in December and say, let's go another 3 months with the CR. It's going to be a tough negotiation.
And George, we'll come back to you on energy policy because we're moving on that, and I know you talked to Energy and Commerce, House Energy and Commerce Chairman Waldens, so we'll come back to you on that. But Geof, you covered a lot the energy policy debate in the Senate, the bill that almost made it into law, and
this close,
and well, as close to many other things. So, Energy Chairwoman Murkowski in the Senate wants to bring it back. She seemed to be closer to doing that during the healthcare negotiation. They wanted to throw her something to gain her support. What's going to happen now, if anything?
Well, I said this close. I mean, it went further than any major energy legislation has in 10 years. They got to a House and Senate conference last year. That went down to, I think, into December. The House was, after the election, the House frankly lost all enthusiasm for the conference. They weren't super excited about it to begin with. So they walked away from it. Senator Murkowski and Senator Cantwell, who's the ranking member on that committee, brought it back this year. There's a few changes, but I think it's substantively the same. And they're actually skipping committee this year. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell put it directly on the Senate calendar in July. So it's ready to go at any point. I think for the next few weeks, I think everything is going to be about budget and appropriations matters. So I think it's going to be sort of on the back burner, but it's ready to go. And I know that Senators Murkowski and Cantwell are anxious to get it in there. The House is another story. They've been sort of working piecemeal on various bills, and ultimately where those things go, some of them may show up on the floor this week. I talked to John Shimkus, who chairs the subcommittee on the environment
for
on the
Energy
and Commerce, and he talked about there's a bill, Safe Drinking Water Act and infrastructure, the brownfields reauthorization bills. These are bipartisan bills, which are fairly non-controversial, and they may actually move on the suspension calendar. So they would need a 2/3 vote, but that should happen. That could happen this month in the House. There's also this nuclear waste bill, which attempts to address this always thorny issue of Yucca Mountain, Nevada. That's passed committee, and that could show up at some point this month as well. That one's a little more controversial. I'll defer to George on where Walden thinks he's going, but I know that Mr. Shimkus had said that he's not really clear on where these things go or how they match up with what the Senate is trying to. But there is this $1 trillion infrastructure package that could surface at some point, which could be a vehicle. But
many of the issues that you're highlighting are issues that I discussed with Chairman Greg Walden in August. I spent a few days out in Oregon visiting with him and sat down with him for an interview that parts of that will be in E&E News on Tuesday, so take a look for that. But many of the issues that you're talking about are priorities for him. The top two things he really highlighted that he'd like to see move through his committee this fall are reauthorization of the energy department, which could be a big restructuring of the energy department that I think would be focused on a way of sort of rationalizing some of the laboratories and how they operate, and also maybe looking at some of the missions of the energy department. Then he's also looking at a whole bunch of other things. I think you rightfully mentioned nuclear waste, Yucca Mountain. That's something that moved through committee already, but he'd like to get that to the floor if he can do that. Another big one, a real tricky one, and one that doesn't necessarily break cleanly along partisan lines, is the renewable fuel standard. Walden would love to move something to sort of, clean up and stabilize a lot of the controversy surrounding the renewable fuel standard, which essentially is requirements for adding biofuels to the nation's fuel supply. And he's looking at doing that. That's got to be a tricky lift. Shimkus is in charge of that, but this is something that Walden said he would like to do. He knows if he's going to move that, he needs something that's bipartisan or it will never advance in the Senate. One of the real interesting points, though, that Walden made for me, we're talking about sort of all this big sort of legislation, Yucca and RFS and DOE restructuring, but he also made the point the committee just needs to be ready to go with legislation. In July, there was a pipeline and transmission bill that moved on the House floor, seemingly at the last minute, that came through Energy and Commerce. And Walden told me that the reason he got those bills to move on the floor was because an FAA bill, a reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration, had sort of collapsed and had to be pulled from the floor at the last minute. Leaders were going around saying, hey, what does your committee have that we can move? So don't be surprised if you see some of maybe the smaller bills that the committee is working on suddenly pop up on the floor. Walden is definitely attuned to that, and he has told the committee to be ready with stuff to go.
I think the House is a little less focused on the ultimate process of getting it through because it's easier to do than the Senate.
Right.
And Mr. Shimkus made the same point. He said, "My job is just to have the bills ready to go, and when there's time, we'll do it."
And and one more point to make on the energy bill last year. Walden was not the chairman last year. It was
Yeah.
Fred Upton led the negotiations on it. I asked Walden about that. He said, well, he was quick to say, well, I wasn't involved with it. I know there were a lot of hard feelings over it blew up. And then I said, well, do you want it to come back? He said, he's told Cantwell and Murkowski he's open to it. But when I pressed him for specifics, he didn't offer a lot, and it was pretty clear to me that that is not his top priority this year. I think if he sees some deal in the Senate that might start to look good, and there's pressure maybe from industry guys to say, hey, we need to do some of the things in here, I think he would be open to it. But I think for now it's not their top priority.
And that's interesting to kind of seize on, because you have, well, a clash of priorities. You have the Senate really wanting to do broad energy reform legislation. The House, take it or leave it, it seems. The House wants to do the DOE reauthorization, and when we've asked Senator Murkowski in the Senate, she seems like she's actually even more skeptical than take it or leave it.
I spoke to her about that a few weeks ago, and I don't know if she was aware of that they were doing that, but senators don't tend to pay as much attention to what their counterparts are doing, and vice versa. But I do know that she and Mr. Walden have spoken about various energy matters, including the bill at some point. But when I raised the DOE reauthorization to her, she said, well, what's the reason for doing that? It is somewhat unusual. I don't recall a big reauthorization of a federal agency in quite some time. If ever, I'd have to go back and look to see when it happened last. And that was sort of the question she had. So let's see how that shakes out.
Exactly. Arianna, let's move to you. You've been there. We've been focusing on some other issues, but yours are extremely important. So before we move to climate, regulation. This administration and the Republican Congress, it seemed that regulation, rolling back regulation, and regulatory reform were their top priorities, and they've done a lot. Are we going to see more? Is it going to continue?
Yeah, so I think the major executive orders that have kind of set us up on a path of deregulation and streamlining government. There was one executive order that required agencies to repeal 2 regulations for every new one they wanted to put out. And another executive order established within each agency a regulatory task force, which would be charged with sort of identifying rules that are outdated or need to be modified or updated, and sort of submit those to the White House, and then potentially roll them back. It's unclear if any of that is actually happening. The Unified Agenda came out this summer, and agencies were supposed to sort of identify rules to repeal to offset the cost of new rules, and that was nowhere to be seen. It's unclear if that's a lack of coordination on the agency's part, or maybe just maybe they're just not issuing regulations, so they don't need to repeal new ones. We are starting to see rollbacks. The Clean Power Plan, the Office of Management and Budget has been meeting with stakeholders. I think they've had over 10 meetings to talk about rolling back the Clean Power Plan and potentially issuing a different, less strict rule. In Congress, we've seen a flurry of regulatory reform bills, as they're called. From talking to some sources, it seems like Republican leadership does want at least one to hit the floor before the end of next year. It's unclear what bill that could be. Senator Portman and Heitkamp have released a bill, the Regulatory Accountability Act, which some people have been rallying around, but Claire McCaskill during the markup couldn't support the bill and has recently dropped her own bill. So it's unclear what that will be. There are a flurry of others, the REINS Act, and they're in line with the administration. They all sort of are under this idea that agencies have too much power, and they want to restore the power to Congress. And there's this conflict of, does Congress have the time to take on more responsibility? They're having trouble getting things done as it is. And that's sort of what the administration has been saying too, that they want to streamline, restore power to Congress. Whether that's actually going to happen remains remains to be seen.
It's kind of hard to see how any of those major regulatory reform bills make it through the Senate. How do they get to 60 votes? And like you mentioned,
Yeah.
Senator Heitkamp. There's a few other Democrats who are up for re-election who are a little more centrist than some of the others, who I think people are targeting to support
Right.
those, but it's still kind of hard to make the math work to get to 60, and that's going to be the challenge.
And I think one of the problems that it hinges on is there's this language that's showing up in a lot of these bills that regulators should pick the least costly alternative. And that's causing a lot of tension in terms of, are we weighing the benefits of regulations versus the costs? And you have a lot of fiscal conservatives who want to be, the most cost effective as possible. And then you have people on the left and more moderate saying like, well, it doesn't, we need to be thinking about the benefits. And I think probably in the wake of Harvey, we're going to have a lot more debates about the cost and benefit of regulations too.
And it's interesting, kind of highlighting that there are some Democrats on the moderate side who want this, but if you have a division between Democrat McCaskill and Democrat Heitkamp, two of the people who could kind of try to convince at least some of the in their caucus, that seems troublesome.
Yeah.
For the effort.
Yeah.
Now on climate, tell us, you're working on several stories for next week, on different developments that could happen on climate change on Capitol Hill. The conventional wisdom's that nothing's going to happen on climate change, but there's been nuanced movements that are important. Give us an overview.
Yeah, so there's actually, it seems like kind of somewhat promising developments in terms of the goals of climate activists. There's this bipartisan House Climate Solutions Caucus, which is a Noah's Ark caucus. They add Republicans and Democrats in pairs. And it started last year with 2 members and now is up to 52 members. Some people I've been talking to say that they're going to see membership that sort of heightened growth is going to more stabilize. And what they're really working on is education. So next week they're having a meeting where they're bringing in Olympic athletes to talk about how a decrease in snow as it relates to climate change is hurting the industry and could hurt the tourist industry, which will appeal to Republicans that are not just on coastal states. And the thing that we've seen that the caucus have success with most recently was the House Defense Authorization Act, in which they sort of formed a voting bloc and blocked an anti-climate amendment that was brought to the floor. I've talked to a couple of Republicans in the caucus who say that that's the goal moving forward with appropriations, is to sort of stop anti-climate amendments. Representative Skibell, who's the founding Republican member of the caucus, told me that he calls this the blocking and tackling phase. So the first phase was sort of education and growing the caucus, and now they're going to try to stop anti-climate amendments. Whether or not the Rules Committee lets those amendments even get to the floor remains to be seen. But if they do somehow, it seems like there is this energy to maybe stop some of those.
And this is the week.
Yeah, this is next week. Yeah. And then I guess the one other thing I would say about that is there's this lobbying group, the Citizens Climate Lobby, that has chapters all over the country, and they've really, really been pushing Republicans on climate action to the point where they're mostly focusing on the House right now, but there's some rumblings in the Senate. Some people I've talked to have said there are at least 18 Republican senators who privately will talk about climate change, but are not ready to say anything publicly as it could threaten their positions.
Just to jump in on climate change,
Yeah.
I did ask Greg Walden about that energy commerce when we were going through this agenda. Climate change never really came up. I asked him, do you believe in climate change? He does, but he's not sure about the best ways to handle it. But when I asked him and pressed him for specifics, well, what would you do on climate change? He hardly talks about big picture stuff. He talks about stuff like, expanding hydropower, an issue that's controversial with environmentalists who don't like dams, which are ultimately the source of a lot of hydropower. He talked about things like improving electric grids to allow more renewable energy technologies to be attached to it. If we see anything on climate, especially out of the House, I think it's got to be small ball stuff and stuff that probably is geared more towards industry than the broad sort of policy things of finding ways to attack emissions or things like that.
Yeah, so just to jump on that, there are a bunch of bills that the caucus is looking at that are mostly like renewable tax credits and things like this, smaller things that you're talking about, that they hope they can move. Some people are saying maybe there could be a carbon tax bill that people could start talking about.
I think the Republicans would love a carbon tax bill because they would run campaign commercials the whole
Right,
next year
right.
saying Democrats are trying to tax, the air.
Yeah.
It is striking though that here we are. Donald Trump is the president. He famously doesn't believe in climate change.
Right.
It's a
I won't
hoax.
repeat his term, but the hoax. Yes.
Hoax is the PG word.
And you have Scott Pruitt, who does not
Right.
believe in the science,
Yeah.
is the EPA administrator, and a Republican-controlled Congress, and yet you have a block of moderate Republicans in the House who
Yeah.
are trying to flex their muscles on this issue. So
Well, and I think a lot of a lot of it is Florida people who just are seeing. I mean, I talked to one congressman who said, when you see the streets flooded with salt water, you can't deny that something's happening, and whatever name you give it, they want to address rising sea levels, coastal erosion. So coastal states, I think, are understanding that. I talked to someone who actually said, for re-elections, it's not viable anymore to not address climate change for a Republican, and actually that could hurt your chances of re-election in coastal states.
Well, that's a good spot to wrap it up, and we'll see a lot of kind of previews to come on all those debates. This week, they're taking up a big spending bill in the House to fund EPA, the Interior Department, and a whole slew of other agencies that we care about. There's some action in the Senate, as you've heard. So we'll keep covering it, and we appreciate folks reading. Thank you very much.